Good afternoon and welcome to the May 11th meeting of the Arlington County Board. We are here today for a work session on the Neighborhood Conservation Program. On behalf of my colleagues, we're excited for the presentation and discussion this afternoon. Back in 2018, when the County Board asked for this review, that board was interested, and we are now interested in an objective review of the program, considering the challenges it appeared to be facing then in some aspects of program implementation. The ask of the group, the charge was to evaluate the program's ability to deliver infrastructure in an efficient, cost-effective, equitable, and timely manner to help inform future capital improvement program decisions, Arlington County organizational choices, and related policies, including consideration related to the civic engagement facets of the program. We appreciate the opportunity to learn more today about the program reviews and the key findings in that review and recommendations, and discuss further staff's intended next steps. I learned about this through one of the members in 2018 as this review was getting started. I'm happy that we're here with a summary of the review and a chance to discuss and work on the program. And with that, I'll turn it over to the county manager for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board, and also welcome to all the community members who worked diligently on producing this 90-page report. Maybe today's work session will be discussing 90 pages in 90 minutes. And the report was submitted to me in February. And, I think that I read the entire document, and there's a lot of very interesting pieces of analysis, which we'll go over in the presentation. And the one conclusion, which I was heartened to see, which is that the Neighborhood Conservation Program still provides value in all places within the county. And so, again, I wanted to thank the working group members. I know that Anthony Fusarelli led the staff team on our side with a number of staff, but it's my distinct honor and high privilege to turn it over to the co-chair, Hans Baumann, for a presentation. Hans?
Thank you, Mark. Good afternoon. For those who don't know me, my name is Hans Baumann. I'm a native Arlingtonian and unrepentant Arlington civic activist. It's been my pleasure to be the co-chair of this effort over the past couple of years. I'd like to thank the county manager and the board for the responsibility, support, and trust you've given this working group over the past several years. I believe the detailed report coming out of this thorough review both validates NC's critical role in the county and provides a roadmap for the program to improve in the years to come. I wanted to extend my deepest gratitude to the staff and citizen membership of this working group. Unlike our commission structures, this working group puts staff and citizens at the same table, collaborating to investigate facts and myths about the program and working together to develop paths forward. Everyone, both on the staff and citizen side, did a remarkable job of leaving their biases at the door and coming to the table with an open mind. Though often spirited, our discussions were always grounded in mutual trust and respect. I believe this collaborative approach between engaged citizens and expert staff should serve as a model for future working groups. So thanks to all the working group members, especially the citizen volunteers, for their many dedicated hours to this work. It certainly wasn't easy to remain engaged and focused through what is likely the most tumultuous period our country and the world has experienced in recent memory. Thank you to all of you for sticking with the process, and huge kudos to my co-chair, Anthony Fusarelli, for effectively helping lead us to this comprehensive report we present to you today. Arlington has a long history of being responsive to resident concerns. Whether it's a multi-million-dollar aquatic center, a multimodal street landscape makeover, or simply a new sidewalk on a quiet residential street, the county listens and adjusts to plans based on citizen input. Regardless of whether the program explicitly engages residents or not, activists show up, as you know, and ensure that their voices are heard. Concept and design timelines and project costs are always impacted by this responsiveness to resident concerns. And this is a good thing. It leads to better outcomes, so thank you for listening to us. More so than any other county initiative, the Neighborhood Conservation Program explicitly makes that civic engagement its core driver. The beloved, and sometimes hated, Arlington Way is central to how the program creates engagement, sets its priorities, gains consensus, and ensures execution. So to me, the surprise finding of this report is that neighborhood conservation projects actually don't cost more or take longer to execute than traditional tops-down infrastructure initiatives. By making the engagement a primary upfront requirement of every project, it aligns expectations early on and eliminates surprises during the later, more costly and committed portions of the project. As we consider future infrastructure initiatives, the strong voices of Arlingtonians should be intentionally integrated throughout, not simply as reviews later in the process. Of course, this review found real areas for improvement, and I look forward to the NCAC and the staff working together to improve the NC program. Better branding, better clarity and alignment, and more explicit focus on equity will surely serve to increase the effectiveness of NC for decades to come. Nonetheless, all of this is only possible with proper funding. The NC program has seen its bond funding decrease dramatically over the past decade while construction costs have skyrocketed. Now that the NC program review is complete and its findings reveal a healthy program with sound fundamentals, I urge the county board and county leadership to expand NC funding to ensure its health and success in the future. Thanks again for the opportunity to co-chair this important work, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Baumann. I know Mr. Fusarelli may be next, but a couple of phrases: unrepentant, committed Arlington civic activist, and your comments regarding listening and adjusting based on the inputs and what we hear are two thoughts that certainly struck me. But I've inserted myself, I think, Mr. Schwartz, maybe it's Mr. Fusarelli next, if I'm guessing right.
Yes, it is. Our future planning director, who you cannot ask any questions about his new position, at least for 2 more weeks, Anthony Fusarelli.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, board members. Good afternoon, Hans. Likewise, just wanted to say a few opening remarks as I pull up the presentation. But Hans, not only thank you for your continued efforts and leadership through this process, and I extend that to all of the community members and staff members of the working group. But also, I really appreciate your succinct framing of some of the key recommendations today, which I will cover through in a little bit more detail, as well as the characterization you provided for how the process worked overall. I know when we embarked on this as a hybrid community and staff model, we were a little uncertain of how that would work. There were some examples that worked well in the past, and we were hoping for the same. So thank you for teeing that up, and let me get the presentation started. Okay, so good afternoon. Today we are pleased to share an overview of our Neighborhood Conservation Program Review efforts and final report. We've already, I believe, completed item 1 on the agenda, and so really what I'll be doing now is covering a brief presentation of the final report, focusing on background and process, key findings, recommendations, and next steps, in just a little bit more detail beyond the framing that Hans had provided. We certainly look forward to leaving adequate time at the end to present a few questions to the board for feedback and further discussion. So beginning with the background and process overview. In terms of the program, Neighborhood Conservation, or NC, is nearly distinct in Arlington in its bottoms-up grassroots character. The program's 2 main components include the creation of NC plans, as well as the identification and completion of physical improvement projects. The Neighborhood Conservation Advisory Committee, or NCAC, leads the development of NC plans and recommends NC projects for funding to the county board. The committee covers much, though not all, of the county, with 51 of the county's 63 civic associations currently active in the program. NC plans are prepared by neighborhood volunteers and focus on ways to improve the neighborhood character and conditions. After reviewed by NCAC and the Planning Commission, NC plans are accepted by the county board and serve as a reference when the county considers actions on a wide range of items from land use, capital projects, and beyond. Beyond plans, the other focus of NC is on capital improvement projects that improve neighborhood conditions in meaningful ways. The projects span multiple categories, primarily including the types shown here, such as street improvements, park improvements, beautification, and much more. The program has a well-established process for how NC projects get initially identified and ultimately become active projects, such as those listed here. For active projects, they can be in one of 4 stages, namely at 30% design, in active design, preparing for construction, and then finally in construction. Currently, more than half of the 21 active projects are street improvement projects across various neighborhoods. To us, this is the first known review of the NC program, even though it's existed since 1964. The program review was a directive of the board in 2018, stemming from a desire for a deep dive to closely examine program efficacy, project execution, and equity considerations. Among other reasons, the review arose from the then current and anticipated future budget constraints on both the operational and capital sides of the ledger. The primary deliberative body for this review was a county manager appointed working group, which is 2/3 community members and 1/3 county staff. The full list of working group members are identified here, and were specifically invited to include diversity of perspective and representation to the process deliberations. A little about the process. After kicking off in May of 2019, the working group went through a 6-month discovery phase, learning as much as we could about NC and related programs and policies in that window of time. In early 2020, we formed subcommittees to identify preliminary recommendations and reconvened in early fall after a 6-month COVID-19 related pause. The working group reviewed and vetted an initial draft report in the fall of 2020, and after targeted revisions, the report was finalized in early 21. With that overview of the process, let's move on to some of the report's key findings. And some of this will sound redundant to Hans's opening remarks, but are nevertheless important to underscore. Overall, the working group believes the NC program remains a valuable county asset, though it experiences certain challenges. Among county programs, NC is nearly unique in its bottoms-up approach, empowering residents to surface needs and implement community goals, while also bolstering and strengthening civic engagement. The NCAC connects neighborhoods with the county board, and NC plans provide county staff, leadership, and commissions with on-the-ground knowledge when considering decisions on related matters affecting neighborhoods. In addition to cultivating civic engagement, NC yields physical improvements. Since 1989, the program is responsible for delivering over 500 projects, totaling nearly $100 million in total investment. And while projects over the past 30 years are spread well across the county, as seen here, areas that are more racially diverse see proportionately fewer NC projects than other areas for reasons that the report attempts to identify. Additionally, one of the review's key findings is that NC projects are no more expensive than comparable non-NC projects. In fact, multiple county programs are all proving to be subject to and grappling with sharply increasing materials and labor costs over the past 15 years. As noted in the report, the NC program review was CPHD's identified pilot project related to the 2019 equity resolution adopted by the county board. As such, we applied the resolution's 4 core questions seen here to our review. And to answer these questions, we applied quantitative and qualitative data as best we could, given availability, and also acknowledged that there were key gaps in information that could and should provide better insights going forward. But regarding race and equity, the working group reached several key findings. While the program has roots in historically Black neighborhoods, over time, more NC projects are being completed in neighborhoods with greater share of white residents. In using the Healthy Places Index as another lens, we found more projects are being proposed in areas with better community conditions. Areas that are majority BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and also deemed highly unfavorable per the HPI, have seen less than half the number of projects compared with other areas. And interestingly, though perhaps not surprising, areas with lower HPI scores tend to see fewer street improvement projects, but more park improvement and more streetlight projects through the program. In terms of challenges, recent funding levels have not kept pace with rising costs, and the program now produces fewer than half the number of projects than it did several decades ago. Of the 52 civic associations active in NCAC at the present time, 41 of them proposed one or more projects during the past decade, which we see as a positive trend, indicating a high level of continued interest in the program and projects. As with other programs, rising NC project costs have not been matched with increased funding, thus yielding fewer projects now than decades ago, despite multiple more funding. Apparent here, cost increases vary widely depending on project type, with street improvements and park projects being typically among the most expensive. But more specifically, in our review, we found a variety of factors as being contributing to more extensive capital projects through NC and non-NC programs alike. A quick rundown highlights that these include the program is completing more of the more expensive project types. The scopes of projects proposed by civic associations are often greater than they were in the past. We also noted the increased labor and material costs for construction, in addition to more project inspections and oversight of contractor work. Evolving requirements, including stormwater and complying more so with best practices. Also addressing failing or undersized infrastructure that may change project scope during design and construction, and more robust maintenance of traffic and sediment control plans, in addition to complying with the ADA, and collectively the increased staff time required to create and review project designs. So in addition to reviewing project cost trends, the working group also analyzed where NC street improvement projects were being completed relative to percentage of existing incomplete sidewalk infrastructure. While not providing all the answers, this review did shed some additional light on factors that may be driving the trend for more of these project types to be located north of Arlington Boulevard in more affluent areas over recent decades. But back on funding and outputs over time, the number of completed NC projects per 2-year cycle have been on a downward trend, with recently greater competition for limited funding also available for other important community needs, such as new and expanding schools and the metro system. In 2016, the funding amount per project was 10 times higher than in 2000, when the average project cost was roughly $100,000. In the 2018 bond cycle, funding was further reduced, allowing the program to only fund between 4 and 6 projects per year, compared to a recent proposal list of 30+ projects. And finally, in terms of other operational challenges, the working group found that the program name might help improve branding and marketing, and there may be means to counter ways in which the program might favor homeowners over renters or single-family areas over multifamily residential neighborhoods. The group also found that NC projects may be more susceptible to project stalls, stops, and changes compared with other programs, and that while NC plans often take time to complete, they are sometimes limited in driving county decisions regarding planning and infrastructure. In summary, I'd like to reflect on the core primary conclusions from our discovery phase before getting to recommendations. Overall, NC continues to be a valuable program for Arlington, is an effective way to make meaningful county investments in improving neighborhoods and strengthen civic engagement. And the program can certainly be improved, and staff and NCAC should partner in the future to enhance the program based on many of the working group's recommendations in the report. And so based on its collective learnings, the working group identified a series of policy recommendations, which we'll briefly touch on here. As presented in the report, the strategies and recommended actions generally correspond with 4 overall themes, covering vision and policy, funding, people, and process. And together, the recommendations seek to expand resident participation, increase the number of projects funded over time, streamline the project design and approval process, and better leverage engagement and planning work. And just to briefly highlight key aspects of each in the interest of time, with vision and policy, the overall intent here is for the county to clarify its intentions and vision for the future of neighborhoods, as this appeared to be a missing piece of its overall planning framework. Even as a starting point, simply documenting and compiling all the ways in which the county is focusing on neighborhoods today would be useful and could help set a foundation for potential refinements to the NC project point system, as well as other aspects of the program. In terms of funding, the primary recommendation is to expand resources for NC to keep pace with cost increases, and this should come as no surprise based on the data we shared this afternoon. Supporting this goal, the report also recommends ways to explore new partnerships that could add resources, as well as looking at changes to the point system that could better support a well-balanced mix of larger and smaller projects, especially during times when resources are more limited. Regarding people, the big idea here is to offer NCAC members more opportunities to apply their talents, expand outreach, and serve as a bridge for those members who can and want to play a larger role and take on more. Related strategies here include developing an NCAC marketing and engagement plan, using focus groups to address specific interests or challenges, and strengthen the connections between NCAC members and the county at large. Building on the people-focused recommendations, there are also opportunities to simplify time-consuming requirements for neighborhood volunteers and streamline processes where possible. For example, this could be done through staff-developed toolkits that assist with the creation of NC plans, additional incentives or strategies, and amending approval criteria with the NC petitioning process. Bridging these specific recommendations together with our focus on race and equity, it's important to note that during the implementation phase, staff will look to address race and equity considerations across multiple aspects of the program. This could include, for example, adjustments in areas such as NC plan development or update processes, the NC point system, NCAC specifically in terms of marketing and outreach, means of engagement and how project nomination processes are applied, and also looking at community trainings and workshops and how we approach those activities. So recognizing the sprint we just took through the recommendations, we'll be happy to revisit any in more detail later, but want to conclude briefly with just a few thoughts on next steps. Most recently, the final report was posted to the study webpage, and we provided a briefing to NCAC in late April. We'll be continuing outreach efforts on the report with other commissions and committees as appropriate. After this afternoon's work session, staff will be working with the manager to finalize the first version of the implementation framework to guide staff's work ahead. With that, I'll turn it over to Chikwe Njoku, who leads our Neighborhood Services Division here in CPHD, to talk more about the implementation framework and our questions for the County Board.
Thank you, Anthony. As he mentioned, I'm Chikwe Njoku, Division Chief for Neighborhood Services, and I'll hopefully be joined by Tim McIntosh, who's the Program Supervisor for the Neighborhood Conservation Program. Neighborhood Services will be taking the lead on the implementation, and as we develop the implementation framework, we'll be focusing on developing a project timeline with specific milestones that relate to each of the recommendations in the program report. We plan to identify specific actions that we plan to take as part of the development of the framework and the different partners that we will have both internally and externally, the various departments and certainly with the NCAC and the community. The recommendations will be in 4 strategic areas: vision and policy, process, people, and funding. which relates to the report. And we will also categorize them in shorter and midterm milestones, as some of the items that are in the recommendations we feel we can do in a shorter time period and are more immediate that we can take care of. And then there's some things that require additional conversations with our partners internally and with the community. And so those may be more related to midterm milestones. As already was mentioned, we'll be looking at things through a race and social equity lens as we implement these recommendations. And we will use them to inform future funding for the CIP and also for the general fund. Next slide. So these are the priority areas we wanted to begin to explore as we begin to set up to have the question. Sorry, I apologize. I think my service cut out. So the areas we want to focus on are identifying incentives, non-financial and financial, to assist neighborhoods in carrying out NC program outcomes, and also effectively advancing other county goals and objectives. As was mentioned, some non-financial incentives could include revisions to the point system. They could include NC plan updates. They could also include technical assistance, among other things. Financially, this is something that would be a little bit different, but there are other tools that we think we can use to help incentivize bringing together community, providing additional tools and resources for neighborhoods to be able to reach out to a broader spectrum within their community to gain more input and feedback on NC projects and certainly on NC plan development. We certainly want to work with the NCAC. They are certainly a resource as identified in the plan, working with a subset of the NCAC to explore how we can continue to strengthen neighborhoods through some of the opportunities we have with looking at things like incentives and other resources to bring to the community. We also want to facilitate partnerships through not-for-profits businesses to help strengthen neighborhoods. The not-for-profits in Arlington have a lot of resources that we think can be useful in helping us work with neighborhoods and also to provide additional ideas for how we can support the NC program. And certainly, we've already been doing some work in some of the neighborhood business districts, and we want to continue to explore other ways that we continue to bring those business districts and the neighborhoods that surround them together to work collaboratively to strengthen neighborhoods. As mentioned before, broader outreach to effectively engage hard-to-reach populations. This is something, again, we may want to explore through providing additional resources to civic associations so that they can expand their outreach and connection with various populations within their civic association. You may recall 2 years ago, we did the Energize Arlington workshops, and those were very successful in bringing together civic associations to share ideas across the board about how they can do outreach to multifamily properties. And so we want to continue to build upon those types of activities in order to provide additional resources and information to help neighborhoods come together and help support the NC process. And finally, as in summary of all above, providing additional technical assistance, workshops, and things to help civic associations and other community groups with their NC plan development and also in other civic engagement activities that help build neighborhoods. The NC program certainly is an infrastructure program, but the infrastructure is supported by civic engagement. And so we want to continue to help build that civic capital in order to continue to work on NC projects, but also in other areas of interest to the county and the broader community. And so with that, these are the three questions that we hope will guide the discussion going forward with the board, and it also will help us with the development of our framework. And with that, I can turn it back over to either Anthony or Matt.
Thank you, Mr. Njoku and Mr. Fusarelli. Looks like you've, Mr. Fusarelli, you're ready for us to go ahead and work on these questions. So I'll open it to colleagues unless I see thoughts from staff, further thoughts from staff. And I'll start with a question, not seeing hands just yet. I'll start with just a question regarding slide 24. The first question is, are there clarifying questions on the information presented? And so I may have it, I'm looking for the map of projects. It may be a little further Yes, that's the one. Thank you. So I'm just trying to look at the areas that are the darkest color on this map. And I think there's overlap, but not in every case, with the areas where there's the highest levels of poverty. I just am curious, there are 10 or 11 or maybe 12 civic associations. I think this is probably for Mr. Fusarelli. It's that don't participate in the program. I'm kind of trying to gauge whether the dots in those 3 west end of the pike, I believe it's census tracts. Do we know whether that's those are sort of proportionately, those civic associations are getting the same number of projects? I think there was another slide where you talked about it, but I wanted to kind of zero in, because there's of course racial equity, and then there's economic equity, distinct, overlapping more than or inequity overlapping more than we might like. But is it a fair assessment to kind of to try and clarify that there have been still fewer projects in some of our poorest neighborhoods a little bit than the racial equity that I think you also raise concerns about?
Certainly. So if I could take a stab at that, if I understand the question correctly. I think in looking at the data, what we found were a couple of things. One is that overall, we had a really complete data set for NC projects over the past 30 years. And so that's why it stops at or begins at 1989, depending on how you look at it. During that 30-year period, when we try and compare the amount of NC projects that are completed in areas like that the HPI qualifies as sort of least favorable in terms of community conditions, or have the highest percentage of BIPOC populations, through both of those lenses, those areas don't appear to be getting sort of their fair share, so to speak, of the number of NC projects compared to the broader county population. That being said, over time, that there have been improvements. I think we observed improvements in that trend, where over the past decade, let's say a higher share of projects are being completed in those areas, compared with maybe during the 1990s and the 2000s. I think one of the trade-offs there is that with each passing decade, the program is completing fewer and fewer projects because of the cost increases. So, I think we had a number of observations, and I think we, concluded that there isn't a straightforward answer. But when we look at some of these data sets in a particular way, it seems like there are opportunities to think about the future of the program and how they might more strategically target more projects in some of these areas, if that's helpful.
Sure, that is. And the point about the funding levels is, I know, was a big topic of discussion in 2018. Certainly the more limited capital CIP last year, it contributes to that. And I think under the circumstances, a right decision. I think that's helpful, and it's good to know that you can see some of a intentionality as we try to work on this. But we'll start with, that helps me, at least on the clarifying point. And over to Mr. Karantonis, I think, who's next on the first of these 3 questions. Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Fusarelli, Mr. Baumann, for all this work. Mr. Nyoku, that's amazing. Mr. Fusarelli, also congratulations to your soon-to-be new job, which is a very, very nice piece of news that we got this week. That's great. So I wanted to ask you something that's very close, and I would stay at the same slide. So there are a few neighborhoods that I know very well in their under non-NC area and non-participating civic association, and referring specifically to Arlington View and Green Valley and below on, say, to south. So, so they appear here as not receiving any investments from NC, or very, very, very few. How did we deal with this? Or what is the intention to deal with that in the future? These are neighborhoods, as you know, that have a significant number of a significant population of minority citizens, minority residents, Black and ethnic.
Yep. No, thank you for that question. I think one of the interesting things we learned during the discovery phase is that, and part of this was anecdotal, and then part of it was based on other research or data sources that are out there. But clearly, the NC program has its roots, and Tim McIntosh or others can add as needed. But the NC program has its roots in 3 of the historically Black neighborhoods in Arlington, in terms of Arlington View, Halls Hill, and Green Valley. And one of the interesting pieces of information we learned along the way in trying to just understand, why are the 12 civic associations that are not active in the program today, like, why are they not active? And we can hypothesize all we want, but there was one piece of data that we had received via an email correspondence from a leader in the Arlington View neighborhood that explained that basically, as of 2020 or 2019, the neighborhood has sort of benefited from projects over time. There have been a number of investments in that neighborhood. There's been other ways or means for that neighborhood to realize some of the change that it's aspired for, and that maybe competing with other neighborhoods to, for a limited pool of resources to NC wasn't necessarily in anyone's best interest. So, that's just one piece of information. We unfortunately didn't have other insights from the 10 or 11 other non-active civic associations. And I think one of, again, the limiting factors of having project level data only back to 1989 is it doesn't show the whole picture. But at the same time, if projects haven't occurred in neighborhoods over the past 30 years, what does that say about the progress that's being made in those neighborhoods as well? So not sure how thoroughly that addresses the question, but if Tim or others have anything to add, I would defer to them.
Sure. Thank you, Anthony. And Mr. Karantonis, I just wanted to add a little bit to what Anthony said. I think he's pretty much got it right. A lot of the data that we have prior to 1989 doesn't reflect a lot of the projects that we did have in the Green Valley neighborhood or Arlington View, which was a neighborhood that was the recipient of a lot of the original ones. To his point, there hasn't been as much activity through the NC program in those 2 neighborhoods in the last 30 years. I think Chikwe can speak to the kind of work that's been going on in Green Valley with the John Robinson Jr. Town Square. So a lot of work has been done, and we have partnered with him on some smaller items in that neighborhood. But I just wanted to sort of reiterate, that with the data only going back to 1989, it doesn't really tell the full picture in some ways.
Okay, thank you. I have to say, I'm not very surprised to see these neighborhoods in the last 30 years not receiving any investments attributed to NC, because this is visible. When one walks from one neighborhood to the other, and I live pretty close by to one of these boundaries, the difference is immediately visible, tangible to anybody. This is really an issue for me as we look forward and as we focus on equity. This definitely will be an issue for me to make sure that access to program investment will be equitable. Thank you for now. I don't want to monopolize I have other questions, but in a second round. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Karantonis. Miss Crystal is next, I believe.
Thank you. So bridging from both a clarifying question into maybe some feedback, right? So 1 and 2 of the prompts here. I was really intrigued to see the recommendation, I think this was a little later in the slide deck, about clarifying and communicating other funding streams and ways of neighborhood serving projects pursuing county investment. I don't want to put words in the group's mouth. I think it might have been, well, nevertheless, I think as I understood it, it was certainly one of these 4 slides here. The point being that there are other infrastructure programs, and we could make communities more aware of what those might be. We have grown up in recent years programs around safe routes to school, for example. The Neighborhood Complete Streets program, which is exciting because it is tactical and flexible and cheap in a way that NC projects, which are sort of definitionally permanent alterations for the improvement of the landscape, are not. And so I wondered, as you all did the analysis of so many years of projects, did you all take any type of look at how many of those projects, you know, if implemented or brought forward and here in 2021 might have been eligible for another stream?
Thank you for the question. I don't believe we did that specific analysis. I will say that we did, as a group, look at, as part of the discovery phase, we did take a deep dive into the range of existing county programs that could deliver infrastructure similar to the neighborhood infrastructure that NC delivers. And so that was a baseline level of information that we shared and discussed as a group, but we did not do the type of targeted analysis that you just asked about in terms of comparing the project data over the past 30 years.
Yeah. Excellent. And I think as I go back, I'm looking at my version of the deck too, that was sort of the idea of clarifying the county's priorities for neighborhoods and their infrastructure. So I see that, maybe I misread that with my enthusiasm, but I see that as potentially an opportunity for clarifying, here we go, clarifying the county's intentions regarding the future of neighborhoods and their infrastructure. So I think the opportunity to sort of make sure folks are aware that NC is possibly the best venue for these larger scale projects, but that there may be other ways to pursue, especially projects of a more tactical nature.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal. I see Ms. Garvey next.
Thank you. Keep the slide right there. I'm going to pick up right where you left off, Katie. Because what I'd like is a little clarification of your request for a clarification, if I could. So under the first bullet, why? Understanding the county's priorities is a time-consuming and complicated process. Could you, I don't know if it's for you, Anthony, or for Hans, but elaborate a little bit on that? Give some examples, if you could, so I understand a little better what you're meaning.
Certainly. I'm happy to start off, and if Hans or Tim or others would like to expand. But I think as part of the working group's discussions related to this point here, I think there was an acknowledgement that, you know, the county has a lot of planning documents. We have a comprehensive plan. It has sub-elements of various disciplines. And as a resident or as a neighborhood leader in a civic association, there's no easy place or no convenient place to go to understand fully what the county's vision may be, what is included in that vision for, you know, residential neighborhoods in particular across the spectrum, right? And so I think that is sort of kind of the overarching framing that led us to this point. We understand that, you know, trying to identify this vision for neighborhoods is probably a heavy lift and is going to require a lot of voices and a lot of energy. And so I think at a minimum, something we've talked about internally has been, well, at a minimum, could we at least identify and catalog everything that the county is currently doing and focusing on in neighborhoods today? And is that a starting point if we have to maybe hold off a little bit on defining what this neighborhood vision or is really all about. But I'll stop there and see if Tim,
I'll see if maybe Hans has anything, if he wants to add, give his take on it.
Thank you. Yes, I would second what Anthony's perspective on this. As a resident basically the comprehensive plan covers all these types of development, but the neighborhood slice of that cuts across all of them. And so understanding what should a neighborhood street look like in 20 years in Arlington is really difficult to understand. And so I've got a street in my neighborhood where people say, oh, it's like a country lane, right? Well, is that how we want that street to look? Curbless and without a sidewalk? Is that an appropriate vision for our neighborhoods? And maybe it is, maybe it isn't, or maybe for certain districts it is, maybe for others it's not. And so trying to think about it from a neighborhood perspective, we tend to give a lot of our development corridors a lot of focus and form-based code and everything else, try to understand what should this look like. But then we drop down to the neighborhood level, and then it's like, oh, then there's neighborhood. Neighborhood. And reality is we don't know neighborhood, I don't think, really very well. It's very hard to understand. Then the other side of it, so there really are two sides to this. One is that, which is sort of the master planning for neighborhoods, which I don't think is an initiative that I've seen evident. Beyond the NC plans, which sort of collectively create one, but again, the NC plans are all independently developed by each of the neighborhoods. But on the other side of the problem here is, as a resident, trying to figure out how to get something done. It's a little bit confounding where there's NC and there's complete streets, there's safe routes to school, there's Walk Arlington, there's Bike Arlington, there's this new work around little streets, and how does that all fit together and what goes where, and just trying to piece together that alphabet soup of different ways of getting projects done is challenging. I think there's an opportunity for us to kind of take a neighborhood look at it and say, let's look at this with a neighborhood hat on. And that's again where I think employing citizens or I should say residents, like members of the NCAC or even Civic Federation or whatever, to say, from your perspective, what do you see? And I don't know that we ask that question very much as a county, and so I'd love to see us doing more of that and help this navigation. Because otherwise you get all these misconceptions. And again, branding is part of this as well, where neighborhood conservation, I'm going to tell a really quick story, and since I've got the mic. I was chair of NC, actually, and I was a member of the NC for 6 years. I was chair for 2 years. And at the end of those 2 years, my mom asked me, so what is neighborhood conservation again? Is that like preserving neighborhoods? And she's lived in Arlington 35, well, at this point, 60 years. And she didn't know what NC was, right? And I feel like we have this problem where residents don't understand the way to get things done in their neighborhoods. And there's an opportunity there. I think it's pretty large. So yeah. I'm going to thank you very much for letting me speak.
No, that's good. That's great. So yeah, I think, I'm a board member who's talked for a long time about the big proliferation of all kinds of plans and all kinds of things that we've got, and no really overarching vision for it, which I think is what we're hearing from you a little bit. I also, and then I'll talk a little bit and then I'll stop. We're not going to solve this here. But what I'm getting from this whole presentation is a sense of taking the NC program to be something much more than it's been. So in the past, it's sort of been very locally focused on the sidewalk, the park, or whatever. And now you're talking about what is the vision for neighborhoods, equity across the county. I mean, really big picture, which are absolutely crucial to, who are we as a community and where do we want to go? And that's a discussion I do think we need to have. And have been needing to have for a long time, and perhaps this is the venue to have it. That would be a long-term thing. That would be on the long-term implementation. But I'm kind of intrigued by this sort of approach to it, because it's really talking about what kind of a community we want to be and where do we want to live. And obviously they're going to be different neighborhoods, but this might be a way to approach it. I think we just have the residents, everybody's a little confused about what we have. And when it comes to all those funding mechanisms, this board member gets confused herself because there really are a lot out there. I'm not your most insightful board member or most organized, but I do, I have been following these things for a while, and it's, I kind of scratch my head sometimes. So I think it's really an important issue that you've raised. And as I say, it's feeling like where you might be heading is something way bigger than NC. So I just kind of put that out there, something for us to sort of think about. And maybe it's the way NC should go, and it could be great. This could be a great structure to do it. But you're talking about revitalizing civic associations, which is a good thing, and reaching hard to reach populations and talking about where we want to live and how it should be. That's a huge conversation to have, and a very good one to have if we can figure out a way to do it. So with that sort of amorphous statement and question, I'll turn over the questioning back to you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Mr. Hans, did you have something?
Can I just give a real quick follow-up to that, just briefly?
Sure.
This slide in particular, I was on the subcommittee. These are issues that are, I believe, yes, you are correct, outside of NC's purview at the moment, but they really strongly influence how NC operates. And so whether or which exact organization needs to solve these problems, that's, I think, a conversation for this body, y'all to have and figure out. But these are really highly impactful things around NC. So I don't want to suggest that we're suggesting NC needs to own and fix all of these things themselves, but the county needs to do so in order to make NC and our neighborhood programs generally successful.
Thank you. No, I didn't get that. It's something that needs to be done, and maybe NC is the mechanism to sort of do it. I don't know. So I don't have any answers for the moment either, but thank you. Thank you for raising it and presenting it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Garvey, for the questions and comments. And looking at this slide, and thank you, Mr. Baumann, thinking back to my understanding of the roots of the program in the 60s and 70s, certainly the 64, but if you think back to then, some of these big questions about how neighborhoods will work together were what led to the founding of programs like this. So it's fitting that we're back to this. I don't have easy or simple answers, but I'm glad that you raised the questions, because what it looks like from a resident's perspective and how this fits with our overall vision and policy are important questions that we need to continue to consider. We'll go to Mr. Dorsey next. I know we have the 3 questions, but I think we're now into, if you have a question, raise a hand and we'll come to you and do another round here. Mr. Dorsey.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So thank you, Mr. Baumann, Mr. Fusarelli, and Mr. Njoku. Really interesting work, and thank you all for the comprehensive approach that you brought to it. In the clarifying questions mode, just as Mr. Njoku, as you were speaking about other sources of funding and potential partnerships and the types of projects, more strategic and less capital intensive, that you could pursue, I was curious if that was still within the framework of NC being all about capital projects, or is it on the table to consider things that have maybe a shorter lifespan, some more experimental or pilot efforts, if you will?
So I'll start off, and then we'll ask the Tim chime in. Certainly, I think one of the recommendations was looking at a mixture of smaller and larger types of projects, things that can be done in the short term, things that may take a little longer. So I think that could introduce the idea of doing different types of projects. Certainly, we have to look at where the funding to do it, but there is an opportunity to look at doing smaller things that are quicker to implement, that not only keep the community engaged, but also address a critical need, maybe looking at things of a more tactical nature. So I think that there is an opportunity to look at that as part of this process. Tim, do you want to chime in on this as well?
Sure. Thank you, Chikwe. I'll just say a few words. I think you've captured it. I mean, one of the things we're thinking is neighborhood conservation is under the Neighborhood Services Division, and we have a mission to work in neighborhoods. And where there's overlap and where staff and the NCAC can help with that, I think there's opportunity there. With the NCAC, there's already a huge network of volunteers that are mostly well connected and well plugged into their civic associations. And I think there's some natural synergies that we can kind of lean on to do different things that we typically may or may not have done in the past through the program.
Okay. Thank you for both parts of that. I just appreciate that we have slide 33 up. I want to, and certainly if there are follow-ups, we'll come back to all board members. But slide 33, I think one of the questions is regarding, are these the right initial priority areas? I think it's the second question, which is on the next slide. But I guess from my perspective, on this slide, the third and fourth bullets of partnerships with nonprofits, businesses, and other groups to help strengthen neighborhoods really strikes me as resonant. And partnerships that weren't all there. I mean, my own experience with neighborhood revitalization and neighborhood conservation is sort of rooted in Habitat for Humanity and the experience of President Carter in not having nonprofits who could work to help serve parts of New York City in some of the riots and unrest, or unrest, I should say, after serious challenges in the late 70s. It really does feel as though partnerships is an area that I'd want to focus on, and certainly partnerships with organizations that we may not have thought of in the neighborhood conservation framework. So for one that comes to mind, it's Bugada, which works on, of course, tenant-related issues. There are others that perhaps have been more involved with NCAC, but I wanted to say that those two bullets sort of stand out to me with respect to your second question. I agree with the others as well. So that's a couple of thoughts. And I see Mr. Karantonis, I see one other hand, and we'll check with Mr. Bauman if I think Ms. McKinley may have a hand up. And for a brief, first, let's go to Mr. Karantonis.
It's mine, Mr. Chair, so I can get in line after Mr. Karantonis.
All right. Thanks. Okay, great. Then Mr. Karantonis and then Ms. Crystal. I think you may be on mute. I can't. Are you there, Mr. Karantonis?
I am on mute. I apologize for that.
No problem.
So, and since we have Ms. McKinley here, she worked very hard in my neighborhood to get a revision of the review of our neighborhood conservation plan and update that. And Mr. McIntosh, and the program was very helpful to organize a charrette, actually a two-part charrette, which I found absolutely amazing. And it opened my mind, or my eyes, to also some other parameters. And that's my question on slide 33. To which extent will we be looking also to things like neighborhood health, like the general well-being of people in the neighborhood? Well, my neighbors, for example, are very often talking about their general perception that's not, they don't feel very safe. There is too much cut-through traffic. I understand that there are other programs that are specifically focused on taking care of these issues, but the ideas about how the neighborhood feels and what improvements are really, worth to pursue, very often come from these general, from these categories: neighborhood health, safety, livability, which is a term that is very often used currently and with good reason. So where would this fit here in the implementation framework approach?
I could take an initial stab at it.
Sure.
So one thought, and again, this is part of what we want to kind of flesh out more in the implementation framework, is if there are specific issues around the health and other disparities within a neighborhood, obviously something that we could do, working in partnership with DHS, could be to have some focused conversations around that with the Civic Association or other community-based partners. One of the things mentioned up here was incentives, financial and otherwise. There are other jurisdictions within the Commonwealth that do fund small types of initiatives through their general fund to do types of projects that bring people together so that they can survey residents and find out some of the challenges or their needs in their specific area, but very localized, very specific. If it's around apartment buildings, around a section of a neighborhood, there's things that we can do that can be more targeted in partnership with groups like the NCAC, in partnership with Department of Health and Human Services, DHS, and others. So We have the opportunity to look at things like that. Green Valley is an example, formerly NAWC, when they did their NC plan, they included a lot of things around human service needs. And that's something that's not traditionally done in an NC plan, but it was something that was important to the neighborhood to capture. And so is that something that other neighborhoods may want to do if we're looking at streamlining the NC plan piece or allowing people to update them? Do we want to have some things in there that provide additional information for other agencies to be able to work with the community on that are more specific to a specific area? So that's just one thought.
Okay, thank you. I really have a very high interest in this. And the reason is because, you know, the neighborhood is always materializing in the subjective perception of the neighborhood by the citizen, by the resident. You walk out of your home, you want to have a nice sidewalk, you want to meet other people, you don't want to be very far away from a public place, from somewhere where you can gather, etc. So this, and you feel better if the things are there and they are available to you. And that is not equally distributed in Arlington. There are places that are fantastic and others that are really deficient. So I just encourage you to look at these factors. It really opened my eyes when I started to see my neighborhood from this point of view. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Karantonis and Mr. Njoku. This is sort of dovetails into the third question that you had for us, and is very interesting to me as well. We'll go to Ms. Crystal for next question.
Thank you. And please let me know if you have trouble hearing me. Speaking of neighborhood improvements, someone in mine is using a leaf blower loudly. Another source of policy consternation for us. If you can't hear me, let me know. I can move to a different location. I wanted to go at what I think might be one of the pretty hard questions on this topic of partnerships or entities in the neighborhood, mostly because we have such a wealth of perspectives with us today, and I don't know that this is the type of context I can get just from reading the report. So NCAC takes as its kind of basic unit of neighborhood, citizen work, community partnerships, all those good things, the civic associations. I want to choose my words carefully because I don't want to paint too broad of a brush of all of our civic associations. We have some that have been doing tremendous work to try to reach out to renters, for example, or to diversify their membership in terms of age demographics, race, background, country of origin. We have also heard many times in our dialogues in race and equity, for example, and in other experiences in the county, that there are instances in which many residents do feel like their civic associations are not environments for them to flourish or feel welcomed. I love the idea that we could support all of our civic associations on a journey to being those types of places, just like the best of our civic associations are. I also want to be realistic. And so I'm also cognizant, when we look, for example, at these maps and say, projects sponsored by these neighborhoods are equal to projects serving our most diverse groups of citizens, that may not always be the case. I mean, we have plenty of areas that are would fall into census tracts of majority minority or low income, where the civic groups who sponsor the NC projects don't reflect that income or racial diversity. And so this is, I'm going to share this largely because it's something I struggle with. I have to imagine this came up in the work group. And with at the risk of putting any of our volunteers in the work group on the spot, I'm really interested in how you all talked about or thought about this. One idea that comes to me is to say that we should look in the future for NC to not only facilitate partnerships with, for example, those renter advocate groups that Mr. DeFerranti was describing, but maybe provide pathways for those renter advocate groups or those PTAs or other place-based members of the community to come forward with their own projects. I know you can tell I'm choosing my words carefully, right? Like I don't want to propose major shifts in power of this program in an off-the-cuff manner, but it is one of the things that I think about quite a bit. And so I am just interested in any insights Mr. Bauman, you or your colleagues have or would feel comfortable sharing from your own conversations? Again, not to put you too much on the spot, or the citizen or staff members of the working group on the spot.
Mr. Bauman, to start, maybe there are other members who'd want to speak up. I think it's an important question.
Yeah, and I want to choose my words carefully too now. I do feel like, again, as with the question of what is what is vision for neighborhoods, this gets to NC being at an inflection, at a very important place between citizens and county government and real funding, and so an NC rep comes out of a civic association, and that NC rep represents the civic association, which is only as strong as the engagement and the work that's been done to fully engage the neighborhood which they're representing, right? And so, in some ways, we have this issue in Arlington, I think, where we have the civic associations and they are looked to by the board for input and guidance, but there's no real formal role for them. And so the civic associations sometimes can be very democratic and representative of their neighborhood, and they sometimes can be not so much so. And that's part of just how we have traditionally allowed civic associations to exist without a clear mandate and a clear part. They're quasi-governmental, but they're not governmental, right? And so I guess what your comments, Ms. Crystal, make me think of is that we do have an opportunity, again, this is outside of NC, but we do have an opportunity as a county to think about the hundreds, if not thousands, of engaged citizens that work for us. We work for ourselves, really, but we're really working for the county board in a sense. Again, I feel like NC relieves a lot of work off the county board because we head off concerns as NC reps or block reps at the neighborhood level to try to understand problems so that there's not a county board meeting 2 years down the line with people complaining about why did you do the project this way, right? And so in some ways, there's an informal there's a formal reliance on civic associations, but an informal mandate and an informal set of expectations around how those should operate and how they should and must engage citizens or not. And so I'm not sure what I'm saying here either, but I
think it's a really interesting insight. I mean, the only thing I would maybe gently and very respectfully disagree with is the idea that it prevents controversial board hearings, because I think, as all of us on the board know, there's actually no project like an NC where people are, because they've had oftentimes so many years to get entrenched. I do, however, find there are few controversial projects on which I feel as confident voting in favor, because I know this is because of that work that you just described. So maybe it does. It prevents the intellectual work, if not the work in front of the meeting. But yeah, I think that's well put. And the point too that, like, we're asking a lot of civic associations in terms of staffing NCAC, right? Of doing that citizen advisory work. And so there's almost a kind of give and take there, that the service you provide on the NCAC will somehow, kind of come back to your neighborhood and via the civic association. So thinking about the linkages between those two is a really good nuance that I take away from your comments.
I don't know if anyone else on the committee wants to chime in on that question.
We still do see a hand from Ms. McKinley, and I think multiple board members have probably walked the neighborhood and with Ms. McKinley, but I don't know that she's unmuting, and so I'm sort of trying to read minds through the screen here. So unless you unmute, we will all be ready to listen in other contexts, but if you unmute, we'll be ready to listen right here.
Hi, are you calling on me finally? This is Sarah McKinley. Okay, I'm sorry, my dog is barking in the background. Actually, the topic that you just raised is the issue that I wanted to address. And I think that, be quiet. I'm sorry, I'm talking to my dog. I think that one of the consternation about the NCAC program. And one of the issues that actually precipitated this study is the definition of what a neighborhood is. And the idea that civic associations represent neighborhoods with the definition of neighborhoods being single-family homes. And that was the traditional idea of a neighborhood in Arlington. And as we all know, over half of the housing in Arlington is now multifamily housing. So I think that what we need to do is we need to shift our definition of neighborhood and therefore shift our definition of what the role of the civic association is. Now, I think that my civic association of Columbia Heights is the prime example of this, because Columbia Heights has single family, we have duplexes, we have garden style apartments, we have mid-rise apartments, and we have the elevator buildings. And how do you balance that? And I can tell you that our civic association has made a concerted effort to balance the needs of all of our residents, both renters and owners, both the people who live in multifamily housing. Now, we have proposed 6 projects in the course of our involvement in NCAC, and I can tell you that of those 6 projects, 5 of the 6 were specifically designed to benefit multifamily units. And I think that what the county needs to do is to think about ways to bolster the civic association's ability to represent all those different people. And we are hindered, the civic associations are really hindered from representing people in multifamily units, particularly the high rises. I can think of some measures that the county board could take that would help us to do that. And we would better represent the neighborhoods. And we need to think about the neighborhoods more broadly. So I would say that the only other point that I would like to make is that the feedback that we got from Arlington View was that Arlington View didn't want to be involved in neighborhood conservation at this time because they didn't need anything from the program. Not that they had not benefited from the program in the past, but they made it very clear that they had made a conscious choice not to participate. So I think that before we make assumptions about different neighborhoods, we really need to reach out to those neighborhoods to find out the few neighborhoods that are not participating, why are they not participating? It's not necessarily an element of racism. And we just need to be careful before we make assumptions. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you for both points, Ms. McKinley, and I know you've been very involved. And I guess, Ms. Garvey, unless you have, I'd like to just see if there's a way of asking, I'm not sure whether this is Mr. Fusarelli or Mr. Njoku, regarding the question that was put forward there about multifamily buildings and whether or not that is that something that the program, that sort of, for me, starts to get to the equity question. And there's a civic infrastructure question, and then there's of how do we do that? And then there's, the neighborhood needs of, for example, my old building or that are 10, 12 stories are different than maybe the neighborhood needs when this project was initially created. So I guess it's a question. I don't know, Mr. Fusarelli or Mr. Njoku, whether you have thoughts on that.
Sure, Mr. Chair, I'll take that first and see if Chikwe or others want to expand. But I guess what I will share, some of the discussion we had at the working group, in the working group journey, did touch on, I think, the the matter of the multifamily residential neighborhoods in a variety of ways, right? I think one of the things we've been talking about a little bit here has been related to the difficulties that not just NC or not just civic associations have through NC to engage with residents of multifamily residents. But this is a challenge that the county experiences in many different programs and many different avenues in terms of getting really effective and consistent engagement with our residents, particularly in our transit corridors and our planning corridors in multifamily buildings. So I think there was an appreciation around the challenges that go beyond NC. I think we had some discussion, and I think there's some notion in the report about exploring strategies to make progress there. I think one idea that was verbally discussed in the meetings, but not necessarily, I don't know that it explicitly made its way in the report verbatim, is an idea of, with site plan approvals, is there condition language that might be included that obligates a developer to allow civic associations to engage more directly through a liaison or something? So, that could be a good idea, but it also doesn't necessarily address the hundreds of multifamily residential buildings that have been built over the past 40 years plus. And so are there other strategies we need to explore? I'd say there was also just one other point. There was some vibrant and robust discussion about the different opinions about whether or not renters are inherently less engaged than owners. And I think we had some spirited discussion among the group. That spanned the full spectrum of possible viewpoints there. And so I don't think the report really concluded strongly one way or the other. But I think as we move forward, a lot of what Sarah's points were really getting at is if civic associations are going to continue to be a primary means of implementing the program goals, how can they be better supported to more effectively engage with the full range of their residents and not just a small subset? But I don't know if Tim or Chikwe or others have anything to add.
Yeah, Anthony, I'll add to that. So one of the things that when we had the Energize Arlington workshops back in 2018, there was a session that was specifically on multifamily or engaging multifamily owners or multifamily tenants. And so it was more of a discussion, and I think that we had some representatives from the Crystal City Civic Association, but it was an information sharing opportunity because, again, we don't have all the answers as the county, but a lot of neighborhoods, Sarah, to give an example, have figured out ways to how to access multifamily properties and to connect with their residents and with the property managers. And maybe that's certainly a role for the county to help facilitate those conversations between multifamily property owners, the civic associations, and the county. Certainly, we have the housing division within CPHD that has relationships with a lot of multifamily buildings. And is there a way we can leverage that to help, as Sarah mentioned, to improve those relationships with the properties, which then provides more access to the residents and allows for that information sharing and collaboration from the single family homeowners with the tenants. So that's something we certainly want to explore as part of the implementation framework and getting ideas from what was working in some of the other neighborhoods that may be having more success at it.
Thank you, Mr. Njoku. I don't know, Mr. McIntosh, did you have anything? I do want to make sure we get to Ms. Garvey and Mr. Dorsey.
No, I think Anthony and Chikwe have captured. I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
Got it. Okay, so Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll try to put the 2 and 3 together, the questions, just real quickly, because I think we're probably wanting to wrap up. This whole conversation has been fascinating about civic associations and how we interface. And part of the issue, which I've always felt, this has been part of my problem when I first came on the board with NC, is that they have the right to spend taxpayer dollars in a way, but it's a volunteer organization. And of course, civic associations are volunteer organizations. And so, it's to expect volunteer organizations on any level to be professional and the way we would expect our staff to be, on having all of the accountability and the equity and treating everybody uniformly. And you just don't know what you're going to get when you have volunteers. Yet volunteers are wonderful, and it really makes it very democratic. This is like real democracy, small d. It's really important. But how we're going to use it moving forward, I'm not sure. And that's a huge question that very worthwhile having some people talk about and think about, which I guess would come under maybe the overall rubric of what is the interface of the NC with civic associations. Because I think, you know, as we've said, all civic associations aren't created equal. And sometimes it works really great. And then you get into another, and the NC project is there, same sort of level, but the civic association, for whatever reason, is not. And how are you going to bring it up to the right kind of standards and level that we need to really make sure the projects are good, people are included, and et cetera? I'm not sure what the answer to that question is, but I think it's worthwhile probably thinking through. I really like the point that Ms. Crystal raised earlier on about funding. The fact that NC, that it's in here, you know, that the funding is one set source, but there might be some others. Is there a way to tap that other funding? I think that's a good question to be looking at moving forward. And then, of course, the question on the vision for the county. So I would love for NC to tackle some of these huge issues. You know, what do we want all our neighborhoods to look at? What is our vision of Arlington County neighborhoods? I mean, that's huge. What's our vision for citizen participation and how are we going to do it? Because I think the old models that we have going back to the 1930s, I suppose, is when many of them started. They're just kind of not working for everybody anymore, and they really kind of need to be reinvented, I think. So these are huge questions. I don't know if this group is willing to sort of take them on, but it might be a worthwhile group to talk about it. And I do think they're questions we really need to be thinking through. And I really appreciate everybody raising them. So again, I don't think my questions and comments have been particularly helpful. I just keep kind of expanding what we're looking at. But that was what this report meant to me, really, when I read through it. It was like, wow, this is a qualitative difference. It could be really good, but it feels still not very, you know, it's going to take more work to figure out exactly how far we go and what you want to do. But I really appreciate you raising the questions. And now I'll be quiet. Thank you.
No, thank you, Ms. Garvey. Those questions really help to add to the thinking, and we'll go to Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, a couple of thoughts, you know, one on incorporating multi-family dwellings and having that be better, those being better represented across the portfolio. I think part of achieving success in that is one, really clarifying and getting at what motives people have when they participate in the program. And so for people who consider themselves likely to be long tenured in Arlington County, regardless of whether they're an owner or a renter, I would posit that you're likely going to have a greater degree of participation, and it's going to kind of work on that continuum. The less long tenured you are likely to be, or you see yourself being, regardless of housing type, the less likely you will be to participate. With that, you know, I will say that I think that there's probably a way within the point system or creating some sort of, you know, bonus point opportunities that you could create an incentive for people to find those people who consider themselves likely to be long tenured, even if they live in a multifamily building, and really encourage civic associations to make every effort to do that. Where the county can assist, I think we should be ready to do that. But I am well aware that there are many urban areas that have many more concentrations of multifamily properties where there is effective community organizing that takes place. So maybe it's less what the county can do, but what we can learn from other communities that have done this well. But actually, my larger point focuses on other areas that I would love to see you all think about. And I think it really comes as an add-on to the excellent focus on equity that you've brought to this study. I really like that you didn't just take a surface view of it. You really kind of peeled beneath the onion a little bit. So I would like to applaud that work and just maybe think about in the future, something that NC could spearhead is a neighborhood conditions assessment, if you will, to get an understanding of, from a baseline perspective, what we have in our different neighborhoods to help inform what you've asked the county to do, and that is to come up with a vision for neighborhoods. I think part of equity comes in understanding whether or not you know, the dollars that we spend in a certain area are going to, you know, gild an already flourishing lily versus the dollars being spent elsewhere going to provide basic structures that are present across other neighborhoods in our community. So I know I used a lot of words there. I'm not really sure it made sense, but it did, at least in my mind. And if people are intrigued by it, I'm happy to talk about it further.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. I'll just say that to your neighborhood conditions point, I think of when I served as liaison and went down to Arlington Mill for a neighborhood conservation meeting. I was impressed by the seriousness of everyone there and the knowledge. And so I would like to see if staff might at least have a conversation about a neighborhood conditions assessment, because I do think there's a serious commitment from NCAC representatives. I did want to just mention, with respect to our civic associations, Mr. Gadjahar, our president, current president of the civic associations, has made diversity and inclusion his foci for the past year, for at least 6 months, and I think he's going to continue in that work as in his term as presidency. So I have some hope there. There's work to pursue. I think the point system suggestion from Mr. Dorsey is a great specific way to try and move forward. I would also say that the other area that I would hope we could continue to think about, and board members, you may want to know, we had multiple conversations leading up to this meeting with Mr. Fusarelli and his colleagues, is sort of the additive point. If, I know funding, there was discussion of trying to get funding back up. There's the need for funding for current neighborhood conservation programs. And then maybe there's the question of, is there either something else in NC or something additional that's perhaps separate that could be really to fulfill that equity piece a little more directly for multifamily buildings where there's a higher concentrations of poverty. So those are a few thoughts that I hope staff will consider. I know that really appreciate first congratulations to Mr. Fusarelli and on his upcoming appointment announced this past week. A thank you to Mr. Baumann and all of his colleagues, Ms. McKinley, for joining us. And thanks to colleagues for questions. We will certainly be ready to engage going forward on some of the areas that we brought up. Thank you as well to Mr. McIntosh and Mr. Njoku for your continued work. So with that, we the work session part of our meeting today will be closed, and we are now going to convene a closed session for the board to consider matters that I'll identify in the following motion. I move that the county board convene a closed meeting as authorized by Virginia Code Section 2.2-3711A1 for the purpose of discussing one personnel matter involving an appointee of the county board. Is there a second?
Second.
And I will go ahead just for ease and ask for a vote on that. We'll start with Ms. Garvey.
Aye.
Mr. Dorsey.
Aye.
Ms. Crystal.
Aye.
Mr. Karantonis.
Aye.
And Mr. DeFranti votes aye as well. With that, I'll grab we are in closed session, and colleagues, shall we reconvene 4:40, we'll say, so that everyone can get situated. And we're in a different meeting, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Arlington County Board back from closed session. We will now need to certify, and I will make the motion and the clerk will call the roll. After we've gotten a second, I move that the members of the county board certify that at the just concluded closed session, only public business matters lawfully exempted from the open meetings requirement under Chapter 37, Title 2.2 of the Code of Virginia, and only such public business matters as were identified in the motion by which the closed meeting was convened were heard, discussed, or considered by the board. Is there a second?
Second.
Madam Clerk, would you call the roll, please?
Mr. DeFerranti,
Aye.
Ms. Crystal,
Aye.
Ms. Garvey,
Aye.
Mr. Dorsey,
Yes.
Mr. Karantonis.
Yes.
Thank you. We have now certified. Thank you, Madam Clerk. Thank you, colleagues. Hope everybody has a good evening.
Thank you so
Bye,
much.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.